The cruelest goodbye is often the kindest act no one will ever understand. Naomi Carter stared at the envelope in her trembling hands as the late afternoon sun poured through the cracked window of her tiny apartment on Chicago's South Side, turning the plain white paper into something that looked far more important than it should have. 3 days earlier, she had walked out of William Castellano's estate carrying nothing but a single suitcase, a cardboard box of personal belongings, and a heart that felt too heavy to carry. 3 days earlier, the most powerful man she had ever met had looked directly into her eyes and erased her place in his world with one calm sentence. Pack your things. You no longer work here. No explanation. No accusation. No raised voice. Just cold certainty that left everyone in the mansion frozen in silence. Even now, she could still hear the echo of polished dress shoes against the marble floor as he turned away before she could ask why. She had replayed that moment 1,000 times while lying awake on the worn sofa that doubled as her bed. Had she forgotten something? Broken an expensive vase? Failed to lock a door? Spoken out of turn? None of it made sense. For nearly 2 years she had arrived before sunrise every morning, making sure every hallway reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers. Every room smelled fresh. Every detail remained perfect before William Castellano ever stepped downstairs. She had never been late. She had never complained. She had quietly ignored whispered rumors about business meetings behind closed doors because discretion was part of the job. More importantly, she had cared about people who rarely noticed she existed. The kitchen staff had become family. The elderly gardener always saved her fresh tomatoes in the summer. Even little Ethan, William's quiet 8-year-old son, smiled more easily when she was nearby. Yet none of that mattered when Mr. Castellano dismissed her without a single explanation. The other employees had watched in stunned silence, afraid that even asking a question might cost them their own jobs. Some avoided her eyes. Others looked genuinely heartbroken. Mrs. Alvarez, the head housekeeper, secretly slipped a folded $20 bill into Naomi's coat pocket before she left, whispering that better days would come. Naomi had thanked her with the same quiet dignity she carried through every hardship because dignity was the one possession nobody could fire her from. Then, yesterday afternoon, a courier knocked on her apartment door. He handed her the envelope without saying a word, asked for her signature, and disappeared before she could ask who had sent it. There was no return address, no company logo, only her full name written in neat handwriting she immediately recognized. William Castellanos. She had spent almost 24 hours unable to bring herself to open it, terrified that whatever waited inside would hurt even more than his silence. But now, with shaking fingers, she carefully broke the seal. A single folded letter rested inside. Beneath it lay a small brass key unlike any house key she had ever seen. Her breathing slowed. Her pulse echoed inside the quiet apartment. She unfolded the first page. The opening sentence stole every ounce of air from her lungs. If you are reading this, Naomi, then I have managed to keep my promise for at least 3 days. Naomi lowered herself onto the edge of the worn sofa, her eyes fixed on the elegant handwriting that seemed strangely unsteady compared to the firm's signature she had seen countless times on business documents left inside William Castellano's study. She swallowed hard before continuing. I know you deserve an explanation, but I cannot give it to you today. If I had spoken the truth 3 days ago, I would have placed you in a danger you could not even imagine. You probably hate me now, and perhaps that is exactly what needed to happen. Naomi blinked several times, convinced she had misunderstood the words. William Castellano had never apologized for anything. During the 2 years she worked inside his mansion, every decision had been delivered with quiet confidence, every instruction precise. Every emotion carefully hidden behind calm blue eyes that revealed almost nothing. Yet the man writing this letter sounded different. He sounded tired. Human. She slowly unfolded the second page. The brass key belongs to a safe deposit box at Lakeshore Trust Bank. Do not open it until 10 o'clock on Friday morning. Not 1 minute earlier. Someone will already be waiting for you there. Trust that person even if you do not trust me anymore. Naomi glanced at the old wall clock in her apartment. Thursday afternoon. Almost another full day remained before she could learn what any of this meant. Frustration tightened inside her chest. Why could he not simply tell her everything now? Why hide behind puzzles after destroying her life without warning? She stood and walked toward the small kitchen window overlooking the narrow street below. Children rode bicycles along the cracked sidewalk while neighbors carried grocery bags home, completely unaware that her entire future now rested inside a single envelope. Her mind drifted back to the final morning inside the mansion. She remembered arriving before 6 o'clock, placing fresh flowers in the front hallway exactly as she always had. She remembered Ethan running downstairs wearing mismatched socks because he wanted to show her the wooden birdhouse he had painted for school. She remembered laughing softly as she helped straighten his collar before breakfast. Then William had entered the dining room. His expression had been unreadable. He had looked at his son for only a brief moment before asking Mrs. Alvarez to escort Ethan outside. The room suddenly felt colder. Every employee sensed something had changed. William had walked toward Naomi without hesitation. His voice remained calm, almost gentle, but every word landed with impossible weight. Collect your belongings. Human Resources has prepared your final paycheck. A driver will take you wherever you choose to go. She had searched his face for some hidden clue, some sign that this was all a misunderstanding, but there had been nothing except absolute distance. Even when she quietly asked whether she had done something wrong, he answered with only 4 words. This is not personal. Those words had hurt more than anger ever could. As Naomi returned to the letter, a small folded photograph slipped from between the pages and landed softly on the floor. She bent down to pick it up. It showed Ethan standing beside her in the mansion garden 6 months earlier, both of them laughing while planting sunflowers beneath the bright summer sky. On the back, written in the same careful handwriting, was another sentence that made her heartbeat slow to a whisper. Everything changed the day this picture was taken, even though neither of us realized it then. Naomi held the photograph against her chest as memories she had tried to bury returned with astonishing clarity. That summer morning had seemed so ordinary. The mansion gardens had been glowing beneath clear blue skies while gardeners trimmed hedges that stretched across nearly 3 acres of perfectly maintained grounds. Ethan had insisted on planting sunflower seeds himself after learning in school that they always turned toward the light. His small hands had been covered with dirt within minutes, and he had laughed every time Naomi pretended to be shocked by the mess on his shirt. William had watched from the library window without saying a word. At the time, Naomi assumed he was simply making certain his son remained safe. She never imagined he had been paying attention to something else entirely. Ethan had changed after Naomi became part of the household. Before she arrived, Mrs. Alvarez often whispered that the quiet boy rarely smiled after losing his mother several years earlier. Most employees respected him from a distance, uncertain how to comfort a child carrying so much sadness inside such a young heart. Naomi never tried to replace anyone. She simply listened whenever Ethan wanted to talk, celebrated every drawing he proudly carried home from school, and reminded him that kindness was never a sign of weakness. Slowly, the mansion felt less silent. Even the kitchen staff noticed the difference. Laughter returned during breakfast. Ethan began greeting every employee by name instead of hiding behind books or headphones. On weekends, he would ask whether Naomi could help him bake chocolate chip cookies, although they usually ended up making more flour clouds than cookies. Once, after they accidentally burned an entire tray, William unexpectedly walked into the kitchen. Naomi had immediately apologized, expecting criticism for wasting expensive ingredients. Instead, William quietly picked up one of the uneven cookies, tasted it, and after a thoughtful pause simply said, "It needs less time in the oven." Ethan had laughed so hard that milk nearly came through his nose. Naomi remembered catching the smallest hint of a smile at the corner of William's mouth before he turned and left the room. It lasted only a second, but everyone noticed it. Moments like that became precious because they were so rare. William remained a man of discipline and routine. Every morning, he left precisely at 8 o'clock. Every evening, he returned at nearly the same time, always carrying the weight of responsibilities Naomi could only imagine. Yet, whenever Ethan proudly showed him a school project or spoke excitedly about something Naomi had helped him accomplish, William always listened, even if only for a few minutes before work called him away again. Looking back now, Naomi realized those quiet moments had slowly changed the atmosphere inside the mansion far more than anyone understood. She unfolded the photograph again and studied the background more carefully. Behind Ethan's bright smile stood William several yards away beneath an old oak tree. He was almost hidden by the afternoon sunlight, his attention fixed entirely on his son instead of the camera. Naomi had never noticed him standing there before. Beneath the photograph rested another small folded note that must have slipped free without her seeing it. She opened it carefully. Only one sentence appeared across the page. "That was the first day Ethan laughed without pretending, and the first day I understood what your presence truly meant to this family." Naomi closed her eyes as tears quietly gathered. For the first time since leaving the mansion, the certainty she had carried for 3 painful days began to crack. Perhaps the story had never been as simple as losing a job. Perhaps it had begun changing long before she ever realized someone else had been silently watching every ordinary act of kindness she believed no one had noticed. Friday morning arrived beneath low, gray clouds that covered the Chicago skyline, making the city feel quieter than usual. Naomi barely slept the night before. She left her apartment before sunrise, carrying the envelope, the photograph, and the small brass key inside her coat pocket as though they were the only things keeping her future together. Every step toward Lakeshore Trust Bank filled her with more questions than answers. The bank stood on a busy downtown corner, its polished limestone entrance reflecting decades of quiet wealth and tradition. At exactly 9:55, Naomi walked through the revolving doors. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood. Men and women in tailored business suits crossed the marble floor with practiced confidence, while soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. She suddenly became aware of her simple navy coat and well-worn shoes, wondering if she belonged there at all. A receptionist greeted her warmly before asking whether she had an appointment. Naomi quietly placed the brass key on the counter. The woman's expression changed immediately. Without another question, she picked up the telephone, spoke softly for a few seconds, then smiled. "Someone has been expecting you, Miss Carter." Naomi's heartbeat quickened. She followed the receptionist down a long hallway lined with framed photographs of Chicago from another era until they reached a private conference room. The receptionist opened the door, but did not step inside. "Please wait here. He will be with you shortly." Naomi entered the room alone. A polished walnut table stood beneath a crystal light fixture. A leather portfolio rested neatly in the center beside a sealed folder bearing her name. Everything felt carefully prepared, as though someone had planned this meeting weeks before she ever lost her job. Less than 2 minutes later, the door opened. An older gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes walked in carrying another file. He wore a charcoal suit and introduced himself with a calm handshake. "Good morning, Miss Carter. My name is Daniel Whitmore. I have served as Mr. William Castellano's attorney for nearly 20 years. Naomi instinctively straightened in her chair. "Is Mr. Castellano coming?" she asked quietly. Mr. Whitmore hesitated just long enough for uncertainty to settle between them. "I honestly do not know," he answered. "My instructions were very specific. If you arrived here today, I was to deliver everything exactly as it was prepared." He slid the leather portfolio across the table. Naomi slowly opened it. Inside rested several official documents, each carefully organized. The first page immediately caught her attention. It was not a legal contract. It was a property deed. She read the address twice before looking up in confusion. It belonged to a modest brick home on a quiet residential street, less than 20 minutes from Ethan's school. Her hands began to shake. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. Mr. Whitmore gently shook his head. "There is no mistake. The property was purchased 6 weeks ago." Naomi looked at the signature near the bottom of the page. William Castellano. The date stopped her cold. It had been signed nearly a month before the morning she was dismissed. Before she could gather her thoughts, Mr. Whitmore placed one final envelope beside the documents. "Mr. Castellano instructed me to tell you only one thing before you read the next letter." Naomi looked up, barely able to breathe. The attorney's voice became softer than before. "He wanted you to know that none of this began on the day you left the mansion. It began long before either of you realized someone else had already started watching your life." Naomi could barely hear the sounds of the bank around her as she unfolded the second letter. Every word seemed to slow time itself. "If you were sitting across from Daniel Whitmore, then you followed my instructions exactly as I hoped you would. I need you to believe one thing before you continue reading. Everything that happened inside my home was intentional, but not for the reason you think. Naomi tightened her grip on the pages. Across the table, Mr. Whitmore remained respectfully silent, giving her space to absorb every sentence. About 2 months ago, information reached me that someone had begun asking unusual questions about the people closest to my family. At first, I believed they were only interested in me. Then I learned they had started collecting names. Employees, friends, anyone who entered my home often enough to matter. Naomi felt a chill travel through her body despite the warmth of the conference room. She remembered several unfamiliar delivery drivers, unexpected maintenance appointments, and strangers she had barely noticed while working around the estate. At the time, each encounter had seemed ordinary. Now they formed pieces of a puzzle she had never realized existed. The letter continued. Most people believe loyalty is measured by who stands beside you. Sometimes true loyalty is measured by who is willing to walk away before someone else pays the price. I could not explain that to you without placing you in even greater danger. Naomi lowered the pages for a moment and looked toward the large windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Thousands of people hurried through the streets below, completely unaware that her understanding of the past week was changing with every line she read. Mr. Whitmore quietly slid another folder toward her. Inside were copies of employment records, a recommendation letter addressed simply, "To whom it may concern," and confirmation that a private education fund had been established in Naomi's name should she ever choose to continue her studies. There was also documentation showing that every payment had been completed weeks before her dismissal. Nothing had been arranged after she left the mansion. Everything had already been waiting. Naomi looked back at the letter with growing disbelief. "You once told Ethan that kindness should never depend on whether someone was watching. I overheard those words from the hallway. You probably never realized I was there. That conversation stayed with me because I understood something I had forgotten long ago. Character is revealed in ordinary moments, not extraordinary ones." Tears quietly filled Naomi's eyes. She had no memory of speaking those words for anyone else's benefit. They had simply been advice offered to a lonely little boy trying to understand the world. Yet somehow those few sentences had reached the one person she believed never truly noticed her. She turned to the final page. The handwriting appeared less steady than before, as though each sentence had required careful effort. "There is still one truth I cannot place inside this letter because paper can travel where trust cannot. Daniel will explain only what he has permission to explain. The rest must wait a little longer. I know you have questions, and I know I have earned your anger. If that anger keeps you safe, then it has served its purpose." Naomi carefully folded the pages together, but before she could speak, Mr. Whitmore reached into his briefcase and removed a small sealed envelope marked with a date exactly 7 days in the future. He placed it gently beside her hand and said, almost in a whisper, "Mr. Castellano instructed me that this envelope must only be opened if he is unable to deliver its message himself." Naomi carefully picked up the sealed envelope dated 1 week ahead and turned it over in her hands. The thick paper felt unexpectedly heavy, as though it carried more than words inside. She looked toward Daniel Whitmore, hoping he would finally explain everything that William had refused to place on paper. The attorney rested both hands on the table before speaking with measured calm. "There are instructions I am permitted to share today, and there are others that must remain exactly as Mr. Castellano left them." He believed timing mattered as much as truth. Naomi slowly nodded. She had already learned that every decision William made seemed to be connected to something larger than appearances. Daniel opened another folder containing several neatly organized documents, including copies of security reports and dates marked on a calendar stretching back nearly 3 months. Certain names had been removed with black ink, but the pattern remained unmistakable. The mansion had quietly increased its security. Employee schedules had changed without explanation. Deliveries had been rerouted. Even routine maintenance visits had been canceled. Naomi suddenly remembered how William had insisted that everyone use the staff entrance instead of the front gate during the final weeks before her dismissal. At the time, the changes had seemed like ordinary management decisions. Now they looked carefully calculated. Daniel folded his glasses and continued. Mr. Castellano became convinced that someone outside his household was attempting to identify every person his family trusted. He could protect his employees while they remained part of the household. Protecting someone after they became a target was far more complicated. His solution was difficult, but in his judgment, it offered the greatest chance that attention would move elsewhere. Naomi lowered her eyes, finally understanding why every memory from her last day carried the same painful distance. William had not acted like a man consumed by anger. He had acted like someone forcing himself to play a role he never wanted. Daniel reached into his briefcase and produced a small notebook. This belonged to Mr. Castellano. He instructed me to show you only one page. Naomi accepted it carefully. The page contained nothing except a list written in William's unmistakable handwriting. At the top was Ethan's name. Beneath it appeared Mrs. Alvarez, the gardener, the family chauffeur, and finally Naomi Carter. Beside every name, William had written a single word: safe. Except beside Naomi's name, where another note had later been added in darker ink: must leave immediately. Naomi felt tears gather once again. She imagined William sitting alone late at night, reviewing names not as employees, but as human beings whose lives mattered to him. Daniel quietly closed the notebook. He revised that page several times. Yours was the last name he changed. Silence settled across the room. It was no longer the uncomfortable silence Naomi remembered from the mansion. This silence carried understanding instead of confusion. She looked again at the unopened envelope dated for the following week. Do you believe I will see him again? She asked softly. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he offered a gentle smile filled with honesty rather than certainty. I believe Mr. Castellano expected that possibility enough to prepare for it. But he also prepared for the possibility that he would not be the one to tell you the final chapter. Naomi slipped the envelope into her bag beside the letters and the photograph. For the first time since leaving the mansion, she realized William had never asked her to forgive him. He had only asked her to survive long enough to learn why he had let her go. 7 days passed more slowly than any week Naomi could remember. She moved into the small brick house whose keys had once seemed impossible to believe were truly hers. Every room felt unfamiliar, yet strangely peaceful. Fresh morning light entered through wide front windows. Birds gathered beneath the maple tree in the backyard. And for the first time in years, she woke without rushing to prepare someone else's home before sunrise. Still, every quiet moment reminded her of unanswered questions. She checked the calendar each evening until the date written on the sealed envelope finally arrived. At exactly 8 o'clock that morning, she sat at the dining table with a cup of untouched coffee and carefully broke the seal. Inside, she found another handwritten letter and a folded newspaper clipping dated only 2 days earlier. The article reported that William Castellano had unexpectedly resigned from every company under his direct leadership. Public statements described the decision as personal, offering no additional explanation. Naomi stared at the photograph printed beside the article. William looked exactly as she remembered him, composed and dignified, yet his eyes carried a weariness she had never noticed before. She unfolded the letter with trembling hands. If this envelope has reached you unopened until today, then you have already done the hardest thing I could ask of you. You trusted time instead of anger. Thank you. Naomi continued reading as sunlight slowly crossed the wooden table. By now you know that I planned your departure long before you believed I had rejected you. There is one more truth you deserve. The house is yours permanently. The education fund belongs to you alone. No conditions. No repayment. They are not gifts meant to erase pain. They are opportunities one should have created much sooner. Tears quietly slipped down Naomi's cheeks. She had spent years believing her work disappeared the moment each floor was cleaned and each room was organized. She never imagined someone had measured her value by far more than completed tasks. William's words continued with unusual honesty. You taught my son that dignity does not come from wealth, titles, or power. I watched him become kinder because of you. Then I realized he was not the only one learning. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that the strongest people in a home are often the ones nobody applauds. Naomi paused and looked around the modest house once more. Every wall, every window, every quiet corner now carried a different meaning. This was never compensation for losing a job. It was William's attempt to build a future beyond his own reach. At the bottom of the final page rested one last handwritten sentence. If Ethan ever asks about me, tell him only the truth. Tell him that I tried to choose people over pride, even when it was too late to explain why. Before Naomi could fold the letter, her telephone rang softly on the table. The caller identification displayed a number she did not recognize. She answered cautiously. A familiar young voice spoke almost immediately. "Miss Naomi?" Ethan asked, sounding older than she remembered after only a single week. "Dad told me that if I ever missed you, I should call this number today. He said you would finally understand everything, and he hoped you might still answer if I needed a friend." Naomi closed her eyes, smiled through quiet tears, and answered without hesitation. "I will always answer, Ethan. Always." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Naomi had almost forgotten was possible. She enrolled in evening business classes using the education fund William had quietly arranged, volunteered at a neighborhood community center on weekends, and spoke with Ethan every Sunday afternoon without fail. Their conversations were simple. They talked about school projects, baseball scores, books they were reading, and the sunflowers that had unexpectedly begun blooming behind Naomi's new house. Yet one subject remained untouched. Ethan never asked where his father was, and Naomi never forced the question. She sensed that William had left behind more than instructions. He had left his son the freedom to remember him without fear. One crisp October morning, nearly 3 months after leaving the mansion, Naomi received another call from Daniel Whitmore. His voice remained calm, but this time there was warmth beneath the professionalism. "Miss Carter, there is someone who would like you to attend a small gathering this afternoon if you are available." Naomi accepted without hesitation. The address led her not to the mansion, but to a quiet park overlooking Lake Michigan where brilliant orange leaves drifted across walking paths beneath the autumn sky. A modest crowd had gathered near a newly planted garden filled with young sunflower seedlings preparing for the next spring. Mrs. Alvarez stood beside the gardener, the chauffeur, several former household employees, and Ethan, who smiled the moment he saw Naomi approaching. Daniel welcomed everyone before unfolding a single sheet of paper. Mr. Castellano asked that this message be shared only after enough time had passed for everyone to begin living their own lives again. The park became completely silent. Daniel read slowly. "If you are hearing these words, then my greatest hope has already come true. You are together without needing me to bring you together. I spent too many years believing protection meant standing in front of people. Naomi reminded me that sometimes protection means preparing them to stand without you. Every act of kindness inside my home changed more than my family. It changed me, although I understood that far too late." Naomi felt Ethan quietly slip his hand into hers as Daniel continued. "Please do not build monuments in my name. Build opportunities instead. Help someone who believes they have been overlooked. Listen to someone whose work goes unnoticed. Respect the person everyone else walks past without seeing. That will honor every lesson I was fortunate enough to learn." Daniel folded the page and looked toward the garden. A small bronze plaque rested beside the first row of sunflowers. It carried no portrait and no grand title. It simply read, "In honor of quiet dignity and ordinary kindness." Ethan smiled through misty eyes before kneeling to press fresh soil around one of the tiny plants. Naomi joined him without speaking. Together, they finished planting every sunflower until the final patch of earth had been gently covered. As the afternoon sunlight reflected across the lake, Naomi realized William's greatest gift had never been the house, the education fund, or the letters. It had been the chance to transform pain into purpose without asking for recognition in return. Looking across the peaceful garden, she understood that some people leave the room before anyone notices the light they carried, and only later does everyone realize how much brighter the world had been because they were quietly there. 1 year later, the little brick house no longer felt like a place Naomi Carter had inherited. It had become the beginning of a life she had built with her own hands. The education William Castellano had quietly provided allowed her to complete a business certificate, and together with a small community grant, she transformed an old neighborhood storefront into a nonprofit career center for domestic workers, caregivers, and anyone who had ever believed their work was invisible. Every person who walked through the front door was greeted with the same respect Naomi had once wished someone would offer her on the hardest day of her life. The walls displayed no expensive artwork, only photographs of ordinary people smiling during new job interviews, graduation ceremonies, and first days at work. Above the reception desk hung a simple wooden sign that read, "Dignity is never part-time." On a bright Saturday morning in early June, the center celebrated its first anniversary. Families filled the room with laughter while volunteers served homemade cookies using Ethan's favorite recipe, still baked just a little less than everyone expected because that was exactly how he insisted they should be made. Now a confident young teenager, Ethan proudly helped younger children plant sunflower seeds in wooden boxes outside the building. Watching him smile so easily, Naomi could still hear William's quiet voice from years before and realized that the greatest promises are sometimes kept by people who are no longer standing beside us. As the afternoon celebration came to an end, Daniel Whitmore approached Naomi carrying a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "Mr. Castellano left one final instruction," he said gently. "He wanted this delivered only after you had created something that belonged entirely to you." Naomi carefully untied the ribbon and opened the package. Inside rested the framed photograph of her and Ethan planting sunflowers in the mansion garden years earlier. On the back, beneath the familiar handwriting she had come to treasure, another sentence had been added. "You once believed you were simply taking care of a house. In truth, you were teaching a family how to become a home." Naomi smiled through quiet tears before placing the photograph on the office bookshelf where everyone entering the center could see it. There was no mention of wealth, influence, or titles anywhere in the building because none of those things explained the story that had unfolded. What remained was something far greater. One ordinary act of kindness had quietly crossed the distance between two completely different lives and continued changing hearts long after both people believed their paths had separated forever. As the evening sun settled across the neighborhood, children laughed beside rows of blooming sunflowers that stretched along the sidewalk, turning their faces toward the fading light. Naomi looked at them for a long moment before gently locking the front door for the night. She understood at last that William had never asked to be remembered as a powerful man. He had hoped to be remembered as someone who finally learned that respect is not measured by authority, but by the lives we choose to protect and the opportunities we quietly create for others. And on that peaceful summer evening, everyone who stepped through those doors carried home the same lesson without anyone needing to say it aloud. That day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.